How would US-backed regime change make the lives of Iranians worse? You're the Western imperialist for being against regime change. No, I don't know if that's how that works. I'm against US-backed regime change because it always leads to a disaster. Even if a government, like say the Iranian government, isn't good, overthrowing it makes the situation worse for the people on the ground. Because it leads to chaos in the country and often creates a power vacuum which leads to civil war, fighting between various groups to see who the new leadership will be. And the country's politics are always manipulated by the US so that Western multinationals can pillage them of their resources. There are countless examples of US and NATO regime change leading to disaster, including within this century. Just look at what happened in Libya. We were told Gaddafi is an oppressive dictator who needs to be taken out for the benefit of the Libyan people. And now the Libyan people have gone from some of the most prosperous in all of Africa to a country with an open-air slave market and horrific poverty, basically no central government. And this is not the fate that I want for Iran and for the Iranian people. I'm okay with them struggling and protesting to change their own regime, of course, but I'm not in favor of my country lying about them or destabilizing them for their own interests, which is what fake news propaganda helps to do. Because yeah, the government's not perfect, but there is a lot of great stuff in Iran built by the people, like their healthcare system, which is currently being hampered by brutal US sanctions. And this is what I am against. US interventionism, because it is nefarious, it only serves the US's interests and the interests of finance capital, not Iranians. They're weaponizing your compassion. Comparing the conditions of Iraq, Iran, and Libya shows how little you know of Iran historically and geopolitically speaking. I mean, I didn't say they were the same thing. Iran is a much more industrially and militarily developed country than Iraq was when the US invaded, so a war would be an even larger disaster, I think. And similar things could be said about Libya, where NATO basically just used bombing campaigns, propaganda, both in the West and in Libya, as well as funding and arming their preferred groups on the ground to eventually overthrow Gaddafi and his government, leaving Libya in an economic, political, and human rights disaster. And even in Syria, where the US hasn't been successful in fomenting regime change, they've still created a disaster and civil war that's killed so many people. So I'm not saying all these countries are the same. I'm saying US propaganda and interventionism has made all their people's lives worse. And the US is actively harming Iranians and trying to foment regime change with sanctions, which are justified by the misinformation propaganda that a lot of people are spreading and supporting. Not only is Iran more developed than a lot of West Asian countries, they're one of the richest countries in the world, twice as big as Germany. This is true and a good point. I think a lot of Americans have an Islamophobic or racist idea of Iran. They think it's just like a big desert or something with no development. But they're an extremely developed country, especially in comparison to Afghanistan and Iraq, where the US has invaded within the last 20 years. Iran's education system and their healthcare system are really advanced. I'm studying healthcare administration in grad school right now, and we read stuff that's coming out of Iran all the time. And not to say countries like Afghanistan had no development before the US invaded, especially in places like Kabul, their capital. But outside of Kabul, it is more of like a peasant economy without as much industrialization and development, which is largely because the US has used Afghanistan as an opium plantation for the last 20 years and meddled in their politics for the last 50 years at least. But ultimately, US war with Iran would be even more destructive than the war in Afghanistan. This will probably be controversial, but I think this part of an interview that Carlos and Noah recently did with Professor Vivek Chibber really well explains a lot of the arguments that have been made against us recently. And this is part of his larger critique of post-colonial theory, so you can check out the full interview at Midwestern Marks. And they're basically talking about the weaponization of identity politics right here.
It's almost like if they attain this priestly status that only through them could the subaltern speak or something. And when that's the case, how do you refute that? Because any argument against the sort of cliche reply is that, well, you're not actually listening, right? That's something.
Well, it's not just that, Carlos. It's also that you guys are young enough to be aware of this. You may not be aware of how seismic a change it is. It's routine in the United States today for people in debates to start their argument by first announcing their ethnicity or announcing their identity. This was never done. It was never done on the left because it was understood that what you're going to be judged by is the quality of your argument, the morality of your position. Whereas now, your skin color is part of the reason your argument is taken to be valid. That is a direct offshoot of this culture in which it's not what you do that determines your place on the left, but who you are. That's a deeply, deeply reactionary position.
Sorry if my poor guitar playing annoyed you, but I think Professor Chibber's theory explains a lot of the arguments that have been made recently against people supporting Iranian self-determination and sovereignty, as well as pointing out U.S. regime change efforts, sanctions, and propaganda. You know, there's one creator who's basically just responding to people and saying, "You're not Iranian, shut the F up." You know, and the actual criticism of them is that they're promoting material which could be detrimental to the sovereignty and self-determination of Iranians. And then there's a lot of people dismissing any argument that doesn't come from an Iranian. And yes, you do need to listen to people in Iran. If you want to understand the situation over there, it only makes sense that you're going to have to read or consume media from people over there. But, you know, you can still be a non-Iranian person and make a valid argument or a valid point. And in my case, I'm working on a video about the internal class contradictions in Iran, but I've mostly focused on what my country, the US, is trying to do to Iran. I've mostly focused on what I can control, my own country, and trying to stop the spread of propaganda, sanctions, regime change efforts, etc. You know, and so many people or bots or whatever are saying shut the F up and listen to Iranians. It's like, it doesn't make sense. I am trying to get my country to stop starving Iran with sanctions so their people can just do what they want.